In the annals of American crime, few names evoke the same chill as Theodore Robert Bundy. Handsome, charming, and educated, Bundy shattered the stereotype of the deranged killer, presenting instead the far more disturbing image of the monster as the boy next door. Between 1974 and 1978, he murdered at least 30 young women across multiple states, though the true count may never be known. What makes the Bundy case so profoundly disturbing, even decades later, is not just the brutality of his crimes, but the stark contrast between his public persona and his hidden nature. As true crime author Ann Rule, who knew Bundy personally before his crimes were discovered, wrote in her definitive biography, "The Stranger Beside Me." Ted Bundy took lives, but he also destroyed lives, those of his victims' families and friends who were left behind to wonder, to fear, and to grieve. Bundy's story represents more than just a catalogue of horrors. It offers a disturbing glimpse into the nature of evil and the limitations of our ability to recognize it, even when it stands before us wearing a winning smile. Theodore Robert Cowell was born on November 24, 1946, in a home for unwed mothers in Burlington, Vermont. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, faced the harsh stigma of single motherhood in post-war America. To avoid this social condemnation, Bundy was raised believing that his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his older sister. Biographer Stephen Michaud, who conducted extensive death row interviews with Bundy, noted, "The shame and secrecy surrounding his birth haunted Bundy throughout his life. He spoke of discovering his true parentage as a moment that shattered his sense of identity and belonging." When Bundy was 4 years old, he and his mother moved to Tacoma, Washington, where she married Johnny Bundy, who adopted the boy and gave him his surname. By all accounts, Johnny was a stable, hard-working man who tried to include his stepson in family activities. Yet, Ted never warmed to him, later dismissing him as not very bright and a person of no consequence. Even in childhood, there were troubling signs. His Aunt Julia recalled waking from a nap to find herself surrounded by knives from the kitchen, with 3-year-old Ted standing by, smiling. As a teenager, he became increasingly withdrawn and socially awkward, struggling to understand the unwritten rules of human interaction that came naturally to his peers. Criminologist Robert Keppel, who pursued Bundy as a detective and later interviewed him extensively, observed, "As a young man, Bundy seemed to be studying human behavior from the outside, like an anthropologist observing an alien culture. He could mimic normal responses, but they never came naturally to him." Dr. Al Carlisle, a prison psychologist who evaluated Bundy, later wrote, "This rejection was a profound narcissistic injury for Bundy. It confirmed his deepest fears about himself, that he was inadequate, unworthy, and fundamentally unlovable. His subsequent crimes can be understood, in part, as a twisted attempt to reclaim power and control." In January 1974, Bundy's carefully constructed facade began to crack. His first documented murder victim was 18-year-old Karen Sparks, a University of Washington student who survived a brutal attack in her basement apartment but suffered permanent brain damage. Within a month, another student, Linda Ann Healy, disappeared from her off-campus residence, leaving behind blood-stained sheets. Over the spring and summer of 1974, a terrifying pattern emerged across Washington state. Young women, most with long dark hair parted in the middle, began vanishing from college campuses and crowded public areas. Witnesses reported seeing a handsome young man with his arm in a sling or on crutches, asking for help carrying books or unloading objects from his car, a Volkswagen Beetle. As true crime author Ann Rule recounted, "The Ted I knew was handsome, charming, and articulate, a former psychology major, a budding young politician, a boy from a good family. The Ted who committed these crimes was a being I had never seen." Law enforcement was initially slow to connect the disappearances, hampered by jurisdictional boundaries and the lack of forensic evidence. By July 1974, however, investigators had identified enough similarities to suggest a single perpetrator. When they released a composite sketch and the name Ted as a suspect, they received multiple calls identifying Ted Bundy, including one from his own girlfriend. But Bundy's clean-cut image and lack of a criminal record led investigators to dismiss him as a serious suspect initially. Meanwhile, in the fall of 1974, Bundy entered law school at the University of Utah and moved to Salt Lake City, where the disappearances of young women soon resumed. What distinguished Bundy's crimes was not just their brutality, but their calculation. Unlike many serial killers who target vulnerable individuals on the margins of society, Bundy specifically chose vibrant young women who were well connected in their communities, ensuring maximum public attention and police resources. His approach combined cunning with audacity. Sometimes he would use a ruse, feigning injury or impersonating an authority figure. Other times, he would simply rely on his non-threatening appearance and verbal skills to approach victims directly. As criminologist Robert Keppel observed, Bundy understood that his all-American good looks and articulate manner gave him a kind of social invisibility. People simply couldn't reconcile his appearance with their image of a monster. Once he had gained control of his victims, typically through blunt force trauma, Bundy would transport them to secluded locations where he would sexually assault them, murder them, and often engage in necrophilia. In several cases, he revisited the bodies multiple times until decomposition made this impossible. Forensic psychologist Catherine Ramsland notes, Bundy's compulsion toward post-mortem activities reveals the depth of his need for total control over his victims. In death, they could not reject or abandon him as he perceived others had throughout his life. Perhaps most disturbingly, Bundy remained active in normal society between his crimes. He worked at a suicide hotline alongside Anne Rule, dated multiple women who suspected nothing amiss, and even assisted in the search for women he had murdered. This compartmentalization of his life demonstrates the profound split in his psyche. Bundy's first arrest came in August 1975, when a Utah highway patrolman pulled him over and discovered suspicious items in his Volkswagen, including handcuffs, a face mask, and a crowbar. While in custody, witnesses from Colorado identified him in a lineup, connecting him to the murder of Karen Campbell in Aspen. Extradited to Colorado to stand trial, Bundy executed the first of his dramatic escapes. While in the Pitkin County Courthouse Law Library preparing his defense, he jumped from a second-story window and disappeared into the mountains. Recaptured after 6 days, he was returned to jail. 6 months later, on December 30th, 1977, he escaped again, this time by losing weight, creating a space in the ceiling of his cell and crawling through it. By the time guards discovered his absence, Bundy had a 15-hour head start. He made his way to Tallahassee, Florida, where his violence escalated to its most frenzied peak. On January 15, 1978, he broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University, brutally attacking 4 young women in less than 15 minutes, killing 2 of them, Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy. Within weeks, he abducted and murdered 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, his youngest known victim. Florida police officer Ken Katsaris, who investigated the Chi Omega murders, later said, "The level of violence in those attacks was unprecedented. It was as if Bundy, knowing his freedom was limited, was determined to inflict as much suffering as possible in the time he had left." Bundy's final capture came on February 15, 1978, when a police officer noticed his suspicious driving in a stolen car and pulled him over. After a brief struggle, the most hunted man in America was back in custody, this time for good. Bundy's Florida trials were unprecedented media spectacles, the first murder trials televised nationally from gavel to gavel. Serving as his own attorney, Bundy used the courtroom as a stage, alternating between charming the jury and unleashing indignant outbursts. As Orlando Sentinel reporter Michael Mello wrote at the time, "The courtroom became Bundy's theater. Even as he faced the death penalty, he seemed to revel in the attention, the cameras, the the newspaper headlines. This was, perhaps, the fame he had always craved. The evidence against him, particularly bite mark analysis matching his distinctive dental pattern to marks on Lisa Levy's body, was damning. On July 24, 1979, Bundy was convicted of the Chi Omega murders and sentenced to death. 6 months later, he received another death sentence for the murder of Kimberly Leach. In his final years on death row, Bundy granted a series of interviews to various investigators and journalists, often hinting at information about unsolved murders in exchange for stays of execution. As his execution date approached, these hints became more explicit confessions, though always characterized by a strategic vagueness. To FBI agent Bill Hagmaier, with whom he developed a rapport, Bundy admitted to 30 murders across 7 states. However, he suggested the true number was higher, once telling Hagmaier, "Add 1 digit to that, and you'll have it." In conversations with author Stephen Michaud, Bundy often spoke about himself in the third person, creating psychological distance from his crimes. As Michaud recalled, he would say things like, "The killer would have felt," or "the killer would have done." It was a way for him to discuss his own actions without directly owning them. Perhaps most revealing were Bundy's attempts to blame external forces for his actions. He pointed to pornography, alcohol, and what he called his entity, a dark aspect of his personality that he claimed took control during his crimes. Dr. Dorothy Lewis, a psychiatrist who evaluated Bundy, believed he suffered from bipolar disorder with possible brain damage, though many experts remain skeptical of pathologizing his evil. In the early hours of January 24, 1989, after exhausting all appeals and confessing to additional murders in a last attempt to delay his execution, Ted Bundy was put to death in Florida's electric chair. Outside the prison, a crowd of nearly 2,000 people celebrated, setting off fireworks and chanting, "Burn, Bundy, burn!" True crime author Anne Rule, reflecting on the man she had once considered a friend, wrote, "I wanted Ted to admit guilt before he died. I wanted him to make that complete break from the life of lies he had led for so many years. I think he did that, but typically he did it in his own way, telling just enough of the truth to tantalize his listeners and keep them coming back for more." In popular culture, Bundy became the prototype for a new kind of villain, the charming psychopath whose outward normalcy makes him all the more terrifying. From fictional characters like Hannibal Lecter to the true crime renaissance of recent years, Bundy's shadow looms large. As criminologist Ann Burgess, who worked with the FBI to develop profiling techniques, observed, Bundy forced us to recognize that evil often wears an attractive disguise. The stereotype of the deranged, visibly disturbed killer was shattered by a man who could have been anyone's neighbor, classmate, or boyfriend.